Hi everyone. Before we get to tonight's episode, I wanted to hop on here with a quick disclaimer. We did have a little bit of trouble with the audio. I tried to clean it up the best that I could, but you will still hear some glitches here and there. So it's nothing paranormal, it's just the internet. We've taken some steps that hopefully we won't have this issue again in the future, but I don't think it impacted the overall interview and what Brian and us were talking about. So just wanted to give you a quick heads up. Thank you guys so much. Enjoy.
Hello everybody, it's me again, Nick, Pennsylvania. I am here with Brendan Bond, and as we alluded to the last time we were together, we are also here with our friend Brian. You may recall Brian, we had a long Bigfoot conversation, and we've missed Brian, and his name keeps popping up in our conversations here, so it's only fair that we've had him back. Well, Brian has some stories to share with us about a building he used to work in, and I'm excited for these because I'm somewhat familiar with some of the stories, but there's a lot more to it. But also, I worked in that building quite a lot as well, and well, I'm just going to give it right over to Brian. Good evening, Brian. How are you?
Good evening, Nick, Brendan. Nice to be back. What I wanted to take some time to talk about is maybe just unpack a little bit about the building that we're talking about. Is an old Victorian building that's been around since 1907 in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Very prominent, well-built sandstone brick building. Has that really old mansion feel to it. And it's a public. It was bought in 1999 and restored for public use, for governmental use. So that's about as far as I'm going to go with any identifying information. But it was a building that I'm working in a professional capacity in 2001. Had a small office there that we leased to perform certain types of contracted services. Over a span of 17 years, I was in that building. Our office changed one time. We moved across the hallway, so to speak, on the other side of the lobby to a corner office. And then they repurposed that space and remodeled it subsequently. I've been in that office, it was 2018 when I finished up my work there, and have been back a couple times, maybe more than maybe a half a dozen times contractually, because I'm still involved. And they've remodeled some of those areas where I was in and moved some people around. There's been a lot of adjustments in personnel since that time, but I haven't really talked to anybody since that time about any activity or anything. So really what we're talking about here is a span of 17 years where there was paranormal activity of a variety of types. There was noises and repetitive kinds of sequences. There's also a lot of just noises and intelligent kinds of movement within the building that I noticed, especially early on. And then towards the end, there was a lot of just very odd experiences where elevators would open up constantly when I was in the hallway. Toilets would flush. But just to kind of get started a little bit, I'm going to break it down into phases and then allow you and Brendan time to kind of digest all that. I'll unpack a certain amount of it and try to break it down into areas that make sense for you to comment on.
Yeah, and I was going to say the last time we were together and talking, I had mentioned that you had said that this was where you experienced a full body apparition, which people in the ghost world and in community, that's kind of the holy grail, so to say. And so obviously I'm very eager to hear these stories. I just want to remind people that, oh yes, that is coming along as well. So
yeah, early on in I'll start off with 2001, and this is truly not going to be War and Peace, but I'll try to move through it a little bit quicker. In 2001, I started my tenure there and would work days and into the evenings. And into the evenings, we'd work there until 8 p.m. There was always two of us there at one time, so we'd never be there by ourselves necessarily. And part of the building, some of us might be providing a particular interview or service in one part of the building. Another person might be in the office proper where we were located. And then we'd leave at night at 8 o'clock, turn the lights off, and go home. What we noticed early on, what I noticed early on, was the fact that there was a lot of manipulation of electronics, particularly the computers, particularly at the time we were using modems, because so a lot of stuff was dial-up at the time. So, there was cabling that was unhooked. We'd be there 2 days a week, plus 2 evenings a week, and we would come back and see things molested in the sense that cables were withdrawn, computers were unplugged from the power source. We couldn't get the computers to work sometimes. There was like bugs and things. And at that time, it was possible you get a virus, but this was not virus activity. This is just mechanical, electronic. Things were falling apart to some degree. And then we were noticing consistently every night when it would get dark, I would hear the shuffling of footsteps up to my door constantly. And then I would also hear people walking upstairs constantly, no one else in the building except me. And you might have a family in the waiting room adjacent to, but no one was walking around. You could account for everybody. And this is a mansion that has 3 floors plus an attic. So it's very large. And all 3 floors were currently being used for office use. And, you could hear doors slamming, you'd hear people shuffling around. Now, let me just kind of say this for the folks that are listening. This was actually a personal care nursing home, private one, back in the 1900s all the way through the 20th century, and eventually was both genders, both male, females. It was not a public home. It was actually a private home.
Yeah, I believe it was into the 1970s, because you had mentioned there's 3 floors. There's also that basement, and that's a big part of the building, but there was an addition that was put on in the early 1960s where I believe it was used as a dining hall, but it's a pretty sizable addition that was put on, and there's the basement to that as well. Like, it's a large building.
It's a large building, and what we were seeing between like 2001 and maybe 2005 was this fairly consistent movements. There was always, once it got dark, and usually in the fall, you'd start to, get dark a lot earlier. Winter, get dark a lot earlier. So it was always like clockwork, hearing, and there would be people in there receiving the service that we were providing. And even during daytime, there was things that would be pointed out to me. I had a young person who I was working with, a child, who literally, I was in one of the visit rooms, which I don't know, Nick, if you know where they were. They're kind of off on the first floor. There's some office areas.
Yeah, I do remember where they were. They've moved them around since, I mean, you've already alluded to the building has been renovated a couple times. But I remember they were off to the right, like on the opposite corner from where your office was, as I recall.
Yeah, that's correct. And what I would be in a room, and this young person would say to me, "There's an old man ghost standing behind you in front of the closet." Each one of these rooms were like small rooms that people used to live in. So they had they had been renovated for services, but and I just kind of made light of it. I never really reacted to it. I'd say, "Oh, come on, it's not really anything." And I never really saw anything, and I never heard anything. But that happened on multiple occasions where I would be working with a young person and they would say, "Don't look behind you. There's an old person standing behind you in front of the closet." I'm like, okay. So, on for a long period of time. I think in general, I really tried to emotionally just accommodate it. I didn't really try to react to it. I knew that something was unusual that was happening. I didn't really give it much attention. I just kind of, not that I was skeptical, but I think to some degree my brain was telling me, engage some denial. It's probably helpful to you at this point to do that. And I didn't want to be very reactive towards it. And then around 2005, we started seeing apparitions. I had been away on vacation for 1 week, and I came back, and one of my staff members was outside, had around the corner during break. She looked up to the second floor and saw this very thin, gaunt woman with a white face looking out the window, staring at her as she was taking a smoke break. Needless to say, that staff member did not stick around very much longer. She was probably only there for another month or so. Matter of fact, I went through a lot of different staff members during that time. I think people were a little bit unnerved by what was going on. Another unsolicited report from another staff member who had said that they'd heard Irish jig music being played in the conference, like what would be called the conference room now that you and I have been in before. So I did not hear that myself, but these were just, it was a lot of like phenomena that was starting to manifest. And I knew the caretaker of the building, who was an employee of the county, and he was very skeptical. He was an older gentleman, and he would give me the history of the place, and we'd try to put together the context of some of these things. Although he was curious, he really didn't want to know about it. And it wasn't really until about 2006 that I saw the apparition of this woman, this gaunt woman, in her backside. It wasn't even her front. I went outside, I'd heard somebody walking, and I went outside to say, oh, okay, it must be somebody coming that we're supposed to see that might be in the waiting room. I turn around and I hear this swish, 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 swish. It's like a woman who's wearing a long dress making sound as she's walking. I turn around and I would swear it was probably a quarter of a second or maybe even a half of a second. It was not long. And I saw the back side of this woman, very thin in the back of her hair, Victorian style or early 1900s, with this long cobalt blue dress that had lace. And no more did I turn around that she must have known that I turned around, because she went right through the door of my office and did this very unnatural circle turn into the wall. I've never seen anything like that before. Oftentimes you think of ghosts as being, they just kind of move through the wall. This was not. It was like a circle. I'm making a hand motion. Our listeners can't see this, but like a, a circular movement. I mean, split second. And then I heard this pop, kind of like like one of those cap guns that we might have had when we were kids. It was just this pop. And then it was over. It was gone. And I thought, well, to really see what I sense. And my secretary, who was wearing a dress, like a business style dress that day, I heard these footsteps coming down the hall, and it was her. And she says, Brian, you look like you saw a ghost. And I says, I think I did, because I thought that was you, and it was not. And we were able to debunk it. We were able to, I guess we weren't able to debunk it, because we to identify that there were a family that we were working with in the waiting area. There was no individuals everybody was accounted for. And that was around 2006. And then this is the first demarcation, 2007. There was a humongous explosion. I got a call from the place where I worked, and they indicated that there had been an explosion adjacent behind the building. And this was an actual circumstance. So there was apparently a man who was attempting to self-harm, and he had, wired the place up and, blew up 2 or 3 houses on the corner. And this is an actual documented thing. So anyways, once that happened, activity really significantly decreased. The footsteps went away. I think a lot of the decrease in the walking and the steps and the doors and the slamming of the doors and those kinds of things went away. We didn't see this apparition woman anymore. It just seemed like it quieted everything down, and then it really transitioned into something very different. And it was for years. We received a lot of comments from people that were coming into that building saying, I heard this place was haunted. Is that true? And so it was just something that we constantly had to kind of contend with at the same time. But that activity had really decreased after that explosion.
Now, interestingly, I started working with you. It was June in 2009 that I began working at this place. You had alluded to that you were employed by a different company that had rented a room out at this building and were doing work, collaborating with this facility. And from the time I started there, I was very much the person for that county. The funny thing is, I remember one of my first days, it was probably late summer of 2009, and I was in a car with a supervisor who was training me in some things, and she pointed out to the building as we drove past, and she said, that's that agency, that's their building, and it's supposedly haunted, she said. And she even told me, you'll have to ask Brian, who's there more often than I am, about, because I've heard he has some stories. So this would have been, a year, maybe a year and a half after you had that experience with the full apparition. But the funny thing was, she told me that sometimes she would be there in the winter when it was dark earlier, and she would be one of the last people there. She would be doing some reviews or whatnot. And she specifically told me that she had to go to the restroom right before she left. She just, so she was on the phone. She stayed on the phone with her husband the entire time because she was so afraid of being there alone. And I was sympathetic because I remember Brendan and I actually lived in an apartment, and the day everybody moved in, I moved in a little after, but a handyman died in our friend's closet. And I had to live through 2 months there by myself in the middle of winter. So I was working in an auto garage. I would come home. They were all on Christmas vacation. I would come home. I would make something to eat really quick. I would jump in the shower because I was filthy from the auto garage. And then I would lock myself in my room until morning. And I would have either the radio or the TV on. So if I heard anything weird, I could dismiss it. Unfortunately, I would often have things on the radio like Coast to Coast on, and some nights that was just too creepy for me to leave on. But when she told me the story about, I had to be on the phone with somebody, so I called my husband because so she clearly believed enough, she did not feel comfortable being in there. And she, according to what you're saying with the explosion and everything, she had been in that building prior to where things change. So, Brendan, I mean, what do you think of some of these stories here? Because I have a few things I do want to say, but you haven't had an opportunity yet, so I figured make sure you chime in there.
I have half a page of notes already, and I can't believe we're only a few years in. I mean, it's an incredible set of stories. It really is. I mean, incredible in the best possible way. A few thoughts going off of what you were just saying, Nick. I think that it's interesting that the place seems to have it seems to be known that it's haunted to other people, both like you guys said, people who work there, obviously, but also to just random people who are around. Now how much of that I'm hearing these stories and how much of this is like we talked about last week, where you just assume a place is haunted because of how it looks. Creepy old Victorian house, of course it's haunted. That being said, I think that it's interesting whenever a place has a mix of residual type hauntings and the more intelligent type stuff. Because originally it sounded like it was mainly residual, but as you're telling some of these stories, Brian, it does sound more like either a mix or even maybe even more on the intelligence side of things. Things that are interacting with you guys more, things that are showing up and presenting themselves to people in a purposeful way. When you mentioned the story about the kids seeing these apparitions of a man, like, one, that's just super creepy. I give you a lot of credit for being professional in that situation, because some of us wouldn't be as professional. I know I'd have a hard time with it.
Emotionally accommodate is the phrase that you use, Brian.
Yeah, no, which is true, and I think that, like, but I think it's important to call out, like, not everyone would handle that gracefully. So excellent work on that. But I think that that leads me to one of my first questions I was going to ask you, was just overall, how did working in a place like this affect you? Because we talk, I mean, a lot of people talk these days about, like, how draining it can be working somewhere that is, a stressful job, let alone an important job, let alone a stressful, important job that is also haunted, And then you kind of mentioned how you kind of almost disassociated with it a little bit. Was that more of a reaction you had, or was that more of a conscious decision?
Portrayed the scenario very accurately. It was a stressful job to begin with. It's an important job. It had a lot riding on it, but you also got to consider that the people that we're working with, there's high emotions being brought into the facility that are different, probably intense, but different than what the entities were that lived there and made that their home. And so you have, and I did a little bit of research on it. And Nick, if you go, or Brennan, if you want to go and put that place into the search engine, you'll find there's a lot more there than what I'm even mentioning, because there was actually another building, Nick, that was in the parking lot that was the original building that was torn down. And I did not know that. But getting back, I'm going off track here a little bit. But, the people that were there were displaced in 1990, removed. And so this new group came in, took over the building, and now we're there. And we're providing services for people that need them, and they're in high stress situations. So yes, I mean, I think I took kind of a professional approach towards this, of saying I have a job to do here. And there was on a couple occasions where I did recognize them directly. As the manager of my operation, I said, I know you're there. It's okay you're there. I know you're there. However, I am working with other people that need me. Once I leave at 8:00, you can do whatever you want. No, I was very matter of fact about it. That's what I did. And for a period of time, I think in the initial years, I was dissociating from it. I was a little bit in denial. I knew something weird was happening. Why is there like a constant going from door to door and slamming them? And, but I finally kind of came to grips with it and said, I need to deal with this because we have an important job here to do. I can't jeopardize what we're doing. Other places are depending on us. And you're trying to normalize things for people that are coming in that are seeing you too. They're from the outside. So did it affect me? Yes, it opened up a substantial interest that I did not realize I had for the paranormal. And I also, and I'll talk a little bit about this down at the end of this, I think it created an awareness that I had some significant sensitivity to things of this nature. Did it ever follow me home? I don't think so, because I don't think that these entities were malevolent. They were benevolent. You just had to kind of recognize and acknowledge them, but also set some boundaries. Now, as the years went on, that had to get a little more firmer, and I had to do some additional things. But in that initial period, that's what I did.
I think that's really interesting. Because like you said, there were other folks who didn't handle the situation as well and ended up, quitting. Which, I mean, we can understand why that would be too much for someone, And I think it's interesting also that there was just a plethora of things that happened over such a long period of time that any of our natural inclinations to debunk things, like the Occam's razor gets thinner and thinner as it keeps happening and happening, eventually gets to the point where you're like, well, actually, it would be more unreasonable if all of these things were explained with mundane circumstances, you know? And it sounds like that really kind of culminates, like you said, with the first time you saw this apparition, which, like, no joke, when you mentioned how it sounded with the dress rustling, as someone who has worked on a lot of theater projects, I know what those Victorian dresses like sound like, you know? And like I got chills whenever you said that, because like that wasn't something I was expecting to be part of the definition of seeing this apparition, which is that's just wild to me. But I also, like I said, I find it fascinating that you also had this groundskeeper, maintenance supervisor, who was much more skeptical, but was still at least willing to like engage with you on trying to like find the history and you know, add some context to some of the things that you guys were seeing. And whenever you mentioned how the apparition moved in that circular fashion, that's like one of the tells I almost always look for when people describe apparitions, because a lot of times people will mention how they don't move how you would expect. Like it's not what you think it's going to be whenever they move. It has a different fluidity or rigidity to it sometimes, which is like hard for someone like me who's never seen something like that to even like kind of wrap my head around, you know? But the whole thing just sounds fascinating. And leading up to the explosion, and the fact that you said that you had you saw a decrease in what sounds like both the residual and the intelligent type haunting activity. It's weird because you would think that like an explosion would add energy to an area in some residual kind of way. So the fact that it had the opposite effect, you know, really makes me kind of question our conventional beliefs about how this energy stuff might work. Really like to know more about that, especially from like if we had like an actual ghost hunter on here to talk about those kind of things. But yeah, those are kind of some of my initial thoughts. Nick, what else did you have to bring up, you thought, from this period at least?
Yeah, no, a couple things that I was thinking of. And of course, I feel very much akin to the maintenance person here in this situation, because, you know, I've always talked about so often when we hear stories, footsteps are such a common story or feature in haunted places. And I always point to, well, I want to know more about the heating system and how it's kicking on, and the wood, and of course the age and everything. So the things that interested me a lot with your stories, Brian, were the things like the cables being unplugged and things like that. That's more than something that I can really easily dismiss. And of course, you know, if it's something like a mouse or something like that, that can obviously be in a building. There would be more than they were just unplugged cords. It would be these cords were chewed upon or something like that. I remember working as a security officer in a call center, and that would occasionally happen, especially in the winter when things are trying to get in to be warm. Yeah, the cord thing was something that stuck with me. Hearing the children say, you know, there's a person behind you, not unsettling, right? And of course, the children are often, that's another classic feature. Children often are said to be more perceptive to these things, or maybe kids just know this and know like it puts people off, because I would be very uncomfortable if a child said that to me. But the thing with the full body apparition that I found really interesting is the sound in which it left. Like you compared it to a cap gun, but also that it wasn't so often when people say they saw a full body apparition, it's facing them, it's showing them, it's like a deliberate thing. Whereas this, it sounds like you almost just happened to see it just by luck or the lack of it, depending on how you feel about it. You saw it from behind, and it wasn't a deliberate showing. That's what's really interesting to me.
With the sound that it made, with the whenever it left, the only thing I can liken that to, whenever they talk about things appearing and disappearing, like an app port happening, there's often a sound reported that sounds like a big like crack almost, which might sound similar to, like you said, like almost like a cap gun. Now, what that is, where it comes from, I have no idea. Like what physically, but it makes you think something physically is happening, like something is entering or leaving whatever spectrum or plane or whatever. I just wanted to echo what Nick said. I thought that was a fascinating element to your story, Brian.
Thank you very much. I think and just kind of responding to what you're saying about what I saw was that it was an unintentional viewing of this person. And I think, this person had been making herself shown to other people, within a year. And I think I might have surprised the entity, because I came out she didn't know I was going to come out. I call it a she because I know it was a female. And it was very brazen, because we had other people in the building who were in a waiting room behind a door. The door was closed, if I recall, because we wanted to kind of keep some privacy. And I just went out there thinking, oh, this is my secretary. I'm gonna, say, hey, what are you doing? Whatever. And it was not. That's the thing. And for me to think that was the secretary, and then within more than 10 seconds she comes walking, gallivanting across the lobby. It was just purely bizarre. And for her to say to me, I think you look like you just saw a ghost, Brian. Like, yes, I think I did.
Yeah, that's just absolutely wild. Where when things like that happen, you're almost like, you kind of question your sanity for a sec, where you're just like, this is almost too, it's almost too on the nose. You're like, someone has to be messing with me almost. But then after seeing something like that, you're like, well, I guess this is just how these things naturally go, I guess.
It reminds me, Brendan, of one of your stories, actually, and I think you've shared it here early on. Was we work at a studio in a neighboring town, and it was an old hardware store back in the 1920s to I think through the 60s. I'm not 100% sure, but the building, it's an older building, and there's our studios are up on the second floor, and there's a big wide staircase in the center of the building. And Brendan told me he walked in one morning, and do you want to tell the story, Brendan, or should I just finish it?
No, go ahead, finish it. You're doing a good job.
All right. Brendan walks in early one morning, flicks the lights on, the lights bzzz, and then Brendan said to me, I swear I heard a voice say hello or welcome, and you turned the light off, locked the door, and just left and went to the coffee shop instead.
It said hello. The hello was like a crackling electricity, like hello from the light flickering. It like corresponded with that.
So it's that correspondence with you walking in and everything. It was just like,
yeah,
so
it was
just
like
you saw a ghost, or you're entering a building and something says hello to you. It's just,
yeah, and I was just like,
too on the nose, as you said.
Yeah, it's too, yeah, exactly. And that was also in close proximity of the me being up there with a client, and us hearing someone, because the door was locked, and this was in the evening, hearing someone open the door, run up the stairs, and the client was like, I thought we locked that. I'm like, oh, we did, and they went and checked, and there was, of course, no one there. That happened multiple times in short succession. So yeah, we've all been there.
You can't sneak into that building. Everything cracks and creaks, and some of the risers on the steps need attention. But
our question.
Speaking of things that need attention,
anyway,
so there's this explosion in the neighborhood. I don't think they've ever rebuilt where that happened, but things changed after that, you said, and they decreased, which, as Brendan said, that's the opposite of what you wouldn't expect to hear.
The residual footsteps and the people sneaking up to my edge of my door to kind of peek in, and it was almost like you were in a nursing home where you literally have residents who that's what they do. They sneak up to you, or they're curious or whatever. All that went away. It was pretty remarkable because I had actually switched. Our office stayed in that particular portion of the building until 2009. And, there was just mass devastation behind the building. That building, really, the building we're talking about was so well built that there was very little damage outside of the windows cracking. So there was definitely a lot of pressure and force that building did have to absorb. But I think the activity just changed, and maybe it was me. I don't know. It's very possible. And I can't say for certain that it ever completely went away. It's just I started experiencing it completely differently. Keep in mind, I'd been there 8 years now. I'd pretty much learned to absorb a lot of what was going on there. It was kind of normalized. You just kind of dealt with it. But during that time, I would receive a lot of unsolicited reports from other professionals, not of my own agency, but of the other group that was in there, that was their actual office space, where they would have to do on call at night. And sometimes they do at that time and use the fax machine or whatnot. And there were a couple times where there were people that were literally freaked out because they would go in there at like 1 a.m. in the morning, use the fax, and it still had those kinds of experiences happening, the footsteps, the doors, those kinds of things, even after the explosion. But I didn't have that anymore. So I don't know what changed for me. However, what I started experiencing the next phase was just a lot of unusual kinds of circumstances. The elevators, you would have that happen. It would open and close, go up and down, up and down, up and down. We had lights that would turn on. We would have toilets that would flush on their own as you were going by that, because it was a nursing home at one time. So there was bathrooms. I mean, there was probably 2 bathrooms per hallway. I mean, it was just unreal. And what I started noticing also was just a really weird level of energy. And people can laugh at me for saying that, but there was a vibe, there was an energy. It was almost, it was silent and it was darker than what I had originally encountered before. The other stuff just seemed kind of more playful, much more darker. It was quiet. It was something that you would sense. You did not go in certain areas of the building. You did not venture certain places at night. We had moved our building, or our office, interestingly, to a section across the lobby, and Nick knows where I'm talking about. And the next room over, I was told by the caretaker, was known as the dying room. When a resident was near death or was, that was they would move them out of their regular room so that they could monitor them from a nursing standpoint or medical standpoint. That's where they're moved. And we were in that room right next to it. And kind of a funny story with that, my secretary, the same one that we have been talking about, there was a door between our office. It went into that dying room. And I said, "What are you doing locking that door?" She says, "Well, I'm locking it and I'm blocking it." And I says, "Why?" I said, "They're going to come through it anyways. It doesn't matter whether you lock it and block it." But to her, that was a sense of I need separation. So that's kind of like from 2010, I would say, all the way to maybe 2015, 16. We really started experiencing a lot of just this darker vibe. We wouldn't go in different rooms too much. We had certain ones that we would, certain places we would not go to. We would not go to the basement. The basement had a very foreboding, and I'll say it with a capital F, foreboding level of energy. And I was down at I was in there a couple times at night. There was some kind of alarm thing that went off, and we thought there was somebody breaking in, and one of the former employees and I went down there one night to check it out. He and I went down there together. It was just so dark and foreboding. And it was so interesting because it's like a catacomb down underneath there. And it's like time stands still, meaning all of the items and the possessions, if you really subscribe to, possessions having certain emotional things, I mean, that's where a lot of that stuff was, old pieces of equipment, and the old kitchen was down there, and it was kind of really creepy. The old kitchen down in the basement. There was always, you go down there and there's like a pop machine down there, and we go down there to get beverages. We'd run down and then come back up, and you'd hear noises of people or something in the meter room, which is right underneath our office in the basement. And you could hear there was just an energy level that was just so bad that I don't know what happened. So we tended to use less rooms. We tended to get in and out. It was all when with the elevator opening up, every time I come up that one hall from the conference room towards the elevator, that darn elevator would open up on purpose. And I finally just stood in front of the elevator and gave that elevator entity a piece of my mind and said, you need to stop this right now. I'm over you, basically. And if you want to stay here, then you better stop. That was the one time I kind of like drew it. Now, short of like putting salt around my office or some other kind of, sense, something else, burning incense or anything around, I never did that. But we were encountering a lot of like just weird stuff at that point in time. And, of course, the area around this building, the community is darker. It's not maybe the best part of town per se. And there was a lot of dark activity going on around it.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys just basically had everything you could to have this place be haunted. It sounds almost, if someone was like, hey, where should we go and what should we do to get a place to be haunted, this has like all the hallmarks. And I just think that's fascinating because it's almost like a chicken and egg kind of thing where like, is the place haunted because of like all of these things that you're talking about, like the stuff being there, it being Victorian, how old it is, what it was used for, or is it the fact that we as people see it go into a place and it just checks every one of the boxes? It doesn't sound like there's been any untimely deaths, and it doesn't sound like it was a TB ward. That sounds like the only thing in Western PA that it's not missing. And it's incredible, I think, that you had that many people who probably come from all different faiths and walks of life and belief systems and stuff, all having the same reaction to the place. So whenever like you say like, oh, it has a foreboding vibe with a capital F, like I know what you mean. And it seems like that's backed up by how everyone else is reacting to it as well. So I think if I was in your shoes, I probably would have felt a little bit of at least I would say almost like camaraderie with the people you're working with. It's like almost like, hey, we're all dealing with this. This isn't just something that's in my head. Like this isn't just, oh, this place is creepy or I get a weird vibe off of it. If everyone else does, that seems to I don't know, that would probably make me feel better. Did that help at all, working with other people who agreed with you?
Yeah, I think so. I think we were always on edge though. There would be maybe 3 of us behind there. I usually have a staff member that would rotate in. I didn't have people leave anymore or anything like that. We would rotate some people in from our main office through there to kind of assist with picking up the slack. And it was just generally accepted. We discussed it. We kind of, intellectualized what it was, and we kind of just dealt with it. And I know one of the other people I worked with, he did the same thing. He just kind of like spoke directly to whatever was doing it. It just seemed like at that time between like 2016, whoever they were, was doing more and more and more to get us the heck out of there because they didn't like it. And it also seemed like at the time that as 8 o'clock approached, you wouldn't hear much activity before 8 o'clock. But if we stayed over a little bit past 8 o'clock, you'd start hearing the activity kicking up. You'd start hearing some of the old type of residual things that I said we weren't hearing before, but it would wait until after 8 o'clock. It was so strange.
It's strange, but that reminds me of whenever we talked to both Josh and Seth about the Center of Harmony and specifically Wonder Bar early on in one of our early episodes, something that's both of them mentioned is how, especially in Wonder Bar, as soon as the sun goes down, doesn't matter what time of year, what time it is, whether it's 4 o'clock or 8 o'clock, but as soon as the sun goes down, the vibe in that place very, very much changes. And whenever I was there with Seth the one day interviewing him, I got to kind of experience that. And it is, I mean, how much of that was him implanting that into my head and me being like primed for it as we talk about, I don't know. But it is interesting how you hear that about certain places, that whenever there's a certain threshold, whether it's a certain time of year, whether it's time of day, whether it's day, night, morning, things seem to ramp up or just kind of turn on. It's almost like they're punching their time card and getting to work. I just think that's a fascinating element.
I will say I was in the basement once, and I rode that elevator only once as well. We went down. I was there with a worker from that agency, and we had walked down the stairs. We needed to retrieve some things to transport them several counties over, and they were stored down in that basement. And she spoke to me about being afraid of the elevator. But her thing was the elevator is very slow. It was an older elevator, and she was afraid of getting stuck in it because she had heard that somebody gotten stuck in it before. I don't know if that's true, if you can confirm that, Brian, but we rode that elevator back up like fingers crossed the whole time. And I will say, I've spoken about this before. There was a study of a kind that suggested that there are specific design elements, specific room types that make us more paranoid, make us feel more on edge. And I definitely got that vibe being down in the basement. In fact, Brian, you described it as being like catacombs. And that's not a bad description. I remember it being like it's not very well lit, and the colors down there are darker and everything too, and it's spacious kind of feeling, but yet at the same time you go into one room and it feels very big. I remember walking into another room and it's so crammed with things that it felt very tight. It was disorienting, and it didn't feel comfortable down there. I will drive that point home. And the only reason I remember that so well being down there was because it was the only time, and I still go to this building, but it was the only time I'd ever been down there. And it was a weird thing. And I think maybe part of it, how much had I been told about the basement before? I can't say. I don't know, because I've heard a number of stories about this place. It's known locally, and it's known in this work community. Some people have some stories, and the people that don't have stories share other people's stories about it. It's widely spoken of, I guess.
Yeah, the basement, the one time that I went looking for the security, they had a security box or something. We went down in that basement, and I went from the one side to the other, and I went into the maintenance caretaker's tool room, workshop, what have you. It was way over in the corner, kind of like would be on the right, as you're coming into the building on the right-hand side. That corner be like the west or the east side corner of the building. We went in there, and it was just unbelievably frightening in there. And he had a fairly good picture of Jesus Christ, a picture of Jesus Christ on the wall. And it was just like, what am I doing? I mean, this is just like real. I mean, what is this all about? And I said to the individual, the colleague, I says, I think we need to turn around. I think we need to just leave. We're not going to worry about somebody breaking in. We're just going, and it could have been some kind of phenomenon that we heard. It had nothing to do with break. It could have been some entity draining the security box or whatever, making it go off or whatever. But the individual, the actual leaders in that building, let's say upper management of the building that had responsibility for it, were always super. They just never really bought into anything that we said, and there was never any concern. But they never had to stay there at night. Really, it was interesting. I had an opportunity to go up into the attic of that building, and Nick, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to do that. I rode that elevator the whole way up to 4th floor. That was a bad move. Myself and probably 3 other people went up there. We decided, okay, we're going to take a break and just see what's up there. We didn't really have authorization to do it. I don't think we caused any harm. As soon as that elevator opened, there was this yellow caution tape across the entrance. And this is where this maintenance individual, he had his office or workbench or whatever up there. And I'm thinking, that is the oddest place to have an office, would be up there. That'd be the last place, I would think.
Be awful in the summer months.
They actually had residents up there. And if you wanted to really get a feel for what the place really kind of looked like, they literally had old bathtubs. They had old rooms. There was these mannequin, I don't know what you call them, Nick, you would know what they are. They hold they're like wooden things that you'd put like coats on,
like a dress
or whatever, like doors, all this weird stuff up there. It just added to just I'm like, whoa, this is a place we don't need to be going into. But we were so darn curious we wanted to understand what it was like 1920s up there. It was just unreal. So that kind of begs the question a little bit, were we really individuals who were messing with what those entities were used to and accustomed to? There's often a lot of discussion around when you go in and you start doing remodeling and you change the way people live, they get upset with that. And the 4th floor had really remained unchanged from the time that it was built. That was a middle period that I don't know if I want to return back to. It was very, very difficult period working there.
Again, the corroboration, I think, is pretty wild. And I'm really excited to see how this kind of story ends. Well, I guess not ends, because like you said, Nick, you still go there sometimes. But as far as you're working there, Brian, so how did this all play out for you?
Well, probably the last 4 years or so, it got to the point where our referral base with some of the other sources had decreased. We were still doing more contract work for the building, for the entity or the group, the organization that was there. I still do to this day. What we were noticing was there was a lot higher levels of stress within that organization. And there are reasons why that was the case. And there's documented reasons. There was things, and Nick knows what I'm talking about. But I think what was interesting was we started seeing some different things, like fans would start coming on like an overhead. There was one night, there was an overhead fan, and it was in the central clerical area of their organization floor into our office. That thing was going off so fast, it was heating up and we could start to smell smoke, but we never turned it on. And fortunately, we were there to turn it off. I kept hitting the off button on the thing and it wouldn't go off. And I can only wonder if something had happened to create that. There was also just these really, really odd the elevator stuff continued, but it was just really consistently every, I don't know, seconds, the doors would open and close, then you'd hear it move. And I complained to the management of the place and said, hey, you really need to have that elevator looked at. And they couldn't find anything wrong with it. And that just seemed very odd. There was a lot more stress in that building with the populations that were coming in at that time, too. I noticed that every time you would come in there, you just felt what's the word for it? Didn't feel real positive about anything. It felt draining actually to be in that building. And gradually it got to the point where I was the only one really left in the build in our office. We had pretty much relocated everybody out of there. It didn't need all the staff. And it really ended kind of to the point where we made a decision we were just going to move out of there. We could do our operation remotely. And I was actually kind of relieved with that to some degree. Really, there wasn't anything else unusual other than this one thing. And I'm going to this is kind of the ending point for me that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Nick may remember this. The last maybe like 2018, 2019, probably 2017, 2018, the organization set up Halloween decorations in the entire mansion. Do you remember that, Nick?
I remember that because I remember coming in several times, and it was a lot of stuff, and you'd have to duck and things to get around. I do remember that.
They had a lot of animatronics, things that would move, things that would talk. The place looked even darker than usual during the daytime. Often when I look back on it and I'm thinking that was not a good move on their part, because you'll talk about these places that they used to be something and then they'll turn them into like a haunted attraction or something. And it really creates some bad ilk in a place, I think. That's my general belief. And I felt just an enormous amount of negativity at that time. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I think I've become much more open and sensitive. I've discovered some aspects about myself that I'm much more sensitive to things when things happen. I can't imagine how the energy or the entities felt about that. And it was all 3 floors. It was like a haunted house. It was scarier than Disney's Haunted Mansion, in my opinion. I've been through that place millions of times. I don't find it scary at all. This place was really the authentic nature of the attraction aspect of it just kind of mixed with the rest of the energy levels. Didn't think anything of it. They thought it was great. And I didn't think it was so great. And so really, by 2018, we ended up our operation there. And to this day, I will not really go into the building much. I've kind of opted to do most of my work remotely. I'm still doing contract work for the organization, but I rarely, if ever go into the building anymore. I don't know what that means about me, but I will do my stuff in the agencies or people's houses, or I'll have them come over to our organization in another city. So that's kind of the end point of all the experiences. And I'm certainly sure that there's other ones I've forgotten, but that's probably the main points, because I know we probably can't run this for 3 hours.
One of the things I'll say, Brian, is this, and this is kind of how I feel about the place. I never had any of the experiences that you did. And even though, I was well known in that organization because I collaborated with them very frequently, you were definitely, I became a fixture in the place. They were very welcoming to me, but you definitely spent more hours there than I did. So even though, yes, I agree, I felt really not comfortable down in that basement, and I had heard the stories. I never had any of those experiences that you did. What is a feeling of loss for me is that I started a very real part of my private professional life being in that building and with the people and the camaraderie. And I had a lot of really positive relationships, and a lot of those people have moved on. And so when I go into a lot of different places across the Commonwealth to different organizations, or even just when I drive through towns where I've lived, and a part of me always feels like I'm always saying goodbye to things, to times and people and places. And so that's something I carry wherever I go. But that's one of those places that there's that period of time for me, and I feel like you have that as well, that was a very big part of your life, and it's not there anymore in a way. The building's there, but that part of your life isn't.
Yeah, I've actually, I think, kind of come to terms with it. I think the building, you hear about paranormal experiences with people in the building, and they don't want to leave the building for some reason. There was a part of me that did not want to leave that building. I felt like this is really a tragedy that I have to move my office. It was more of a business move than anything else. We're still doing business with this entity, and it's actually going to continue to grow, I think, actually now with the changes that they've made there. So the only difference is we just don't have a physical office in the building. The business itself and the work that we're doing hasn't really changed. We've just changed how we do it. But I've actually kind of come to the point where I feel greatly relieved that I don't go into that building anymore. I don't know why. I think I had reached a point where it had really kind of, I needed to get away from it. And, it provided me a lot of experiences. It also provided me a lot of sensitivity and understanding what you really, a lot of people look at ghost hunting and, investigations, and they look at that stuff and you see it on TV like crazy, and it's glorified. But when you're living it and you're experiencing this stuff, it takes on it. And when you're living it every day, you don't really look at ghost hunting in a glorified way. I don't. It's interesting. I'm interested in paranormal. I'm more open to it. It made me a much more open person. But as far as seeing as a glorified, thing to agitate ghosts, that's not my thing.
Now, I think you said an important thing there for me. I feel like doing this, having these conversations, listening to people's experiences and stories, and talking about general folklore is kind of like Brendan and Mize riding up the elevator to the attic and taking a peek inside, because one of the things we've been asked about is going out and recording things on site at different places we've spoken about in the past. And we plan on doing that, but Brendan and I have talked privately, and Brendan was the one to say it, like, we have no interest in doing the ghost hunting thing, because there's just, it's a level of things. I feel I painted myself as a much more skeptical person on a lot of these things, and I am, but there's a part of me that just, like, for reasons beyond skepticism, it's just like, I don't want to do that. I don't know a good comparison. It's like, I can disagree but be respectful about it, so sort of thing, I guess. This is our ride to the elevator, up the elevator.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
Speaking of courtesies, if you like what you hear, let us know. And also, we're always say it. That segue class I've been going to.
That was great. That was great. Yeah, it's really paying off. At $39.99 a month, it's really.
But please send us your stories. Let us know. Give us any ideas. Like I said, we've been contacted by a few people that think we should go on sites, and so we're planning on making a go of that in some of the places that are in our region. Brendan, how can people get a hold of us?
If you'd like to reach out to us, you can find us on Instagram or Facebook at the Ghost Furnace Podcast, or you can drop us an email at theghostfurnacepodcast.com.